The laughter started before the first shovel of dirt was turned. It came from the porch of the feed store across the gravel road. 3 men in canvas coats holding paper cups of coffee, watching a thin figure drag a corrugated steel cylinder across a frozen field. The cylinder was the kind farmers used for grain, dented along one rib, the galvanizing scuffed to a dull pewter. It had cost him $85 at an auction nobody else bid at. One of the men on the porch laughed so hard, he had to set his cup down on the railing. Another said, loud enough to carry, that the boy was building his own coffin and saving the county the trouble. The boy was 26 years old. His name was Wendell Crane, and he did not turn his head. He kept walking, boots breaking through the crust of last week's snow, the cylinder scraping a long pail wound across the field behind him. He had measured the spot 3 times. He had checked the slope, the drainage, the direction of the prevailing wind off the ridge. He had done the math on a yellow legal pad in a borrowed kitchen, and the math said this would work. The men on the porch had done no math at all. They only had eyes, and what their eyes saw was a skinny kid with no house, no truck of his own, no wife, no prospects, hauling a rusted tube into a pasture in the middle of a Montana January. By the end of that first afternoon, the story was already moving. At the diner, the waitress refilled cups and told the regulars about the Crane boy and his metal barrel. At the hardware store, a man buying chimney brushes mentioned that someone in town had finally lost what little sense he had left. By evening, in 3 separate houses, the same sentence was spoken in 3 slightly different ways. He's going to freeze to death out there, and somebody ought to stop him. Nobody stopped him. Nobody ever does, in places like that. They watch, and they wait, and they sharpen the joke for when the punchline arrives. What they didn't know was that Wendell had spent the last 4 winters thinking about exactly this cylinder, exactly this field, exactly this cold. He had grown up in a single-wide trailer with walls so thin you could hear a mouse breathing in the insulation. He had spent his teenage years stuffing rags into window frames and watching his mother sleep in her coat. When she died the winter he turned 22, the trailer went with her, sold off to cover what the hospital didn't. For 4 years he had bounced between shop floors, bunkhouses, the back seats of cars in summer, and the cots of strangers in winter. He had read every library book the county had on root cellars, ice houses, Quonset huts, sod homes, dugouts, and the strange half-buried winter shelters the homesteaders used to throw together when the railroad ran out of patience with them. He had taken notes in a green spiral notebook that he kept rubber-banded shut. The cylinder was not a whim. It was the conclusion of 4 years of quiet, patient, unglamorous study. He dug for 9 days. The ground was frozen in the top 8 inches, soft beneath, the way Montana clay gets when the snow blankets it before the deep cold finds it. He had borrowed a small backhoe from a rancher who owed his late father a favor, and what he could not move with the machine, he moved with a long-handled spade and his own back. The hole was 16 feet long, 7 feet wide, and just deep enough that when the cylinder was lowered into it on a sling of chains, only the top 14 inches of curved metal stood above the surface of the field. He capped both ends with plywood discs he had cut himself, sealed them with closed-cell foam and silicone, and cut a single hatch into the top, hinged with 3 heavy strap pieces salvaged from a junked stock trailer. From the road, once he was finished, there was almost nothing to see. A low hump in the snow, a black square of hatch, a thin steel pipe rising 6 feet for the stove. People driving by squinted, decided they had imagined it, and kept going. The men on the porch were less generous. They drove out one Sunday, 4 of them in a single pickup, and stood at the fence laughing while Wendell sealed his last seam. One of them, a man named Harlan Bowers, called out that the kid had built himself a soup can with delusions. Another said you couldn't pay him to spend a single night in that thing if the wind got up. Wendell wiped foam off his glove, looked at them for the first time, and said, quietly, that he intended to spend the whole winter in it, and that they were welcome to come back in March and see what was left of him. Harlan laughed all the way home. He told his wife about it over dinner. He told the bartender about it that night. He told the story so many times that within a week, the boy in the buried cylinder had become a kind of local entertainment, the way a stray dog with 3 legs becomes entertainment in a town that has run out of other things to talk about. What none of them came close to understanding was the inside. Wendell had not built a soup can. He had built a layered thermal envelope, and he had built it with a discipline that would have impressed an engineer if any engineer had bothered to look. Against the inner curve of the steel, he had glued 2 inches of rigid foam board, the cheap pink kind, scavenged from a demolition site 60 miles away and hauled home in 3 trips. Over that he had stapled a vapor barrier of contractor plastic, every seam taped twice. Over the plastic he had built a stud frame of 2x3s, curving them by kerfing the backs so they hugged the cylinder. Into the cavities he had packed sheep's wool, traded for 2 days of fence work from a woman north of town who kept a small flock and had no use for the rough fleeces. Sheep's wool keeps its insulating value when damp. He had read that in 3 separate books and underlined it in each. Over the wool he had screwed thin pine paneling, sanded smooth, sealed with a single coat of linseed oil that filled the inside of the cylinder with a warm, nutty smell for the first month and then faded into something cleaner. The floor was its own quiet study. He had laid 3 inches of dry gravel across the bottom of the hole before the cylinder went in, for drainage. On top of the cylinder's curved floor, he had built a flat platform of treated joists with 2 inches of foam beneath and 4 inches of straw bale insulation between. The straw bales were wrapped in plastic, dry as paper, and they would stay dry because the gravel below carried any moisture away from the steel. On top of the platform, he had laid wide pine boards, then a layer of wool felt, then a rag rug his mother had made the year before she got sick. You could stand on that floor barefoot at 20 below outside and feel nothing colder than the inside of a closed barn in October. The stove was the heart of it, and it was the part he had thought about the longest. He could not afford a proper marine cabin stove, and a full-sized wood stove would have cooked him alive in a space that small. So he had built one himself, out of a thick-walled propane tank cut and welded by a retired pipe fitter who took payment in split firewood. The firebox was small, the size of a bread loaf, but the steel was heavy and the welds were clean. He had wrapped the body of the stove in a jacket of stacked firebrick salvage from a torn-down bakery, mortared with refractory clay. The bricks took 2 hours to warm up. They held heat for 9. A handful of pine kindling and 3 split pieces of seasoned juniper, burned hot and fast at dusk, would carry him through to dawn without him ever having to leave the blankets. The chimney was double-walled, insulated with mineral wool, and rose through a triple-flashed collar of sheet metal and high-temperature silicone. He had tested every joint with a candle and a piece of tissue paper, watching for any flicker that meant a leak. There was no leak. He cleaned the pipe every Sunday morning with a brush on a length of fence wire. Ventilation, he knew, was the killer in shelters like this. A sealed box and a fire will quietly empty a man's lungs. So he had built 2 intakes and 1 exhaust, all of them routed through bent lengths of galvanized pipe with screened ends, all of them positioned to draw fresh air across the floor and exhaust stale air near the ceiling. The math, again, came from a homesteader's manual published in 1934 and rescued from a library discard bin in Billings. He had checked the airflow with a strip of toilet paper held in front of each vent. The paper moved exactly the way the manual said it would. None of this was visible from the porch of the feed store. From the porch, all anyone could see was a hump in a field and a thin column of smoke that some mornings was so faint it could have been mistaken for breath. The first real cold came in the 3rd week of November. 22 below at sunrise, with a wind that crawled along the ground and lifted dry snow into the air like flowers shaken from a sieve. 3 ranchers lost calves that night. A pipe burst in the basement of the Lutheran church. The school closed for 2 days. In a tavern 15 miles east, a man got drunk and walked the wrong way home, and the search party found him in the morning curled under a fence line, gone. The county felt the cold the way a body feels a fever. Everyone talked about it. Everyone made a point of asking about everyone else. Almost no one asked about the boy in the field. Harlan Bowers did, finally, on the 4th morning. He drove out alone this time, in the gray light, without telling anyone where he was going. He parked at the fence. He sat in the truck with the engine running and looked across the white pasture at the low hump and the thin pipe of stove smoke, and he watched for a long time before he got out. The snow on top of the cylinder had melted in a perfect oval, refrozen at the edges, melted again in the middle. It was the shape of the warmth underneath, drawn on the surface of the field like a signature. Harlan walked out to it. The wind cut at his face. By the time he reached the hatch, his eyes were watering and his fingers had gone clumsy in his gloves. He knocked, because it seemed like the only thing to do. The hatch opened from below. Warm air rose out of it in a visible plume, the kind of plume you see at the mouth of a cave in winter. Wendell looked up from a small wooden ladder, blinking against the daylight, dressed in a flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. Harlan said the only thing that came to him. He said, "Are you all right in there?" Wendell said he was. He asked if Harlan wanted to come down for coffee. Harlan did. He climbed down the ladder and stood on the rag rug and looked around. The cylinder was lit by a single oil lamp and a small skylight cut into the hatch, glazed with a double pane of salvaged greenhouse glass. The pine paneling glowed amber. The stove ticked quietly in the corner, the firebrick exhaling a steady, even warmth that felt nothing like the dry blast of a furnace and nothing like the smoky huff of a campfire. It felt like the heat that comes off a sunlit stone wall in late afternoon. There was a small table, a narrow bunk built into the curve of the wall, a shelf of books, a hanging rack for clothes, a pot of coffee on a trivet, and a thermometer hung at chest height beside the bunk. The thermometer read 68 degrees. Outside, 2 feet above their heads, the air was 26 below. Harlan looked at the thermometer for a long time. He looked at the stove. He looked at the curved wool-insulated walls. He looked at the rag rug. He took the coffee Wendell handed him, and he drank it without speaking. And when he climbed back up the ladder 20 minutes later, he stood at the hatch in the wind, and he did not laugh. He drove back to town, and he did not tell anyone where he had been. That should have been the end of the story, and in a smaller country with smaller weather it might have been. But the winter that year was not a small winter. It was the winter that the National Weather Service later called the worst single storm system in the northern Rockies in 50 years, a slow-grinding 3-day blizzard that started on the night of January 18th and did not lift until the morning of the 21st. Snowfall totals in the valley reached 44 inches. Drifts on the lee sides of barns climbed past the eaves. Wind gusts on the ridges topped 70 miles an hour. The temperature, at the worst hour of the second night, fell to 41 degrees below zero, and with the wind, the exposed skin numbers were the kind of numbers that stop being numbers and start being verdicts. The power went out across 3 counties on the first evening and stayed out for 61 hours. You have to understand what that means in a place like that. It means no furnaces. It means no well pumps. It means propane tanks freezing at their regulators if they are not protected. It means generators running until the gasoline runs out and then sitting dead in the snow. It means the elderly being driven to the school gymnasium and the volunteer fire department running cots and the sheriff's deputies going door to door in the dark with flashlights, asking people to please come with them, because the house they were sitting in was about to become the same temperature as the air outside. The men on the porch of the feed store did not laugh that week. They were too busy. Harlan helped the fire chief move an old couple out of a farmhouse on the East Road. He carried the woman in his arms because her legs had gone numb. He drove her to the gym and went back out into the storm 3 more times that night. By the second day, his face was windburned to the color of brick and his beard had ice in it that did not melt even indoors. On the 3rd morning, when the wind finally began to drop, somebody at the gym asked about the crane boy. It was a woman, a teacher, who asked. She said his name out loud, and the room went quiet in a way it had not been quiet in 3 days. Harlan was standing by the coffee urn. He set down his cup. He said he would go. 2 other men went with him. They took a tractor with a front blade because no truck would have made it down the road. The drifts on the pasture lane were higher than the cab. It took them an hour to cover what was usually a 5-minute drive. When they finally crested the rise and looked down into the field, none of them spoke for a long moment. The cylinder was gone. That is not quite right. It was not gone. It was buried, completely, under a drift that had built up on its windward side and curled over the top in a long white wave. From where they sat in the tractor cab, there was no hump, no pipe, no hatch. There was only a smooth, swept arc of snow, and at one end of it, the faintest darked, no bigger than a coin, where the chimney's heat had bored a small clean hole straight up through 6 feet of drift. A thin breath of smoke was rising out of that hole. Harlan got down from the tractor. He waded toward the dye. The snow came up to his chest. The 2 other men followed, breaking trail behind him. When they reached the place where the cylinder should have been, Harlan dropped to his knees and began to dig with his gloved hands. He dug for 10 minutes before he uncovered the edge of the hatch. He knocked 3 times, hard. The hatch lifted. Wendell looked up at them with the same calm face he had worn at the fence in November. He was wearing the same flannel shirt. The sleeves were still pushed up. Behind him, The stove ticked. The lamp burned. The thermometer beside the bunk, when Harlan climbed down to look at it, read 66 degrees. It had not dropped 2 degrees in 3 days. Wendell had a kettle on. He had bread rising in a covered bowl on the warming shelf above the firebrick. He had been reading a book about beekeeping. He asked the 3 men if they wanted coffee, and when they nodded, unable for the moment to form words, he poured 4 cups and handed them around. And the 4 of them sat in that warm wooden curve of a room, while above them the wind made its last circuits of the ridge. Harlan asked, eventually, how much would he had burned in 3 days. Wendell pointed to a small stack beside the stove. 11 pieces of juniper were missing from it. 11 split sticks, each about the length of a man's forearm, had carried him through the worst storm anyone living had seen. One of the other men, a rancher named Pete, asked if he could see the notebook. He had heard, somewhere, that the boy kept a notebook. Wendell took the green spiral down from the shelf and handed it over. Pete turned the pages slowly. There were temperature logs in neat columns, dated by day and hour. There were sketches of the stove, the chimney collar, the vent geometry. There were lists of materials with prices beside them, totaled at the bottom of each page. The whole build, from cylinder to rug, had cost him under $900. There were notes in the margins, in a careful pencil hand, that read things like will stay dry, no condensation on south wall, draft holds at 12 below, bricks still warm at 6 a.m. Pete handed the notebook back. He said, quietly, that it was the most useful book he had ever held. They stayed for an hour. When they climbed back out into the daylight, the sun had come through a tear in the cloud, and the whole valley was glittering, raw and white and brutal and beautiful. The tractor was already half drifted in again. They cleared it and turned for town. On the way back, none of them spoke about what they had seen. Not because they were ashamed, exactly, though there was some of that. It was more that they were each doing the same private arithmetic. Each of them was thinking about the man they had laughed at in November. Each of them was thinking about the porch and the paper cups and the joke about the coffin. Each of them was thinking about how easily, how cheerfully, how completely they had been wrong. The story did not stay in the cab. It never does. By the end of that week, half the county knew that the Crane boy had ridden out the storm at 66 degrees on 11 sticks of juniper, while their own houses had gone dark and cold. By the end of the month, the diner conversation had reversed itself entirely. The men who had laughed loudest in November were the quietest in February. Harlan Bowers, when asked about it at the feed store, would only say that he had been a fool, and he would say it without elaboration, in a voice that did not invite follow-up. In March, when the thaw began, 3 different ranchers asked Wendell, separately and quietly, if he would help them build something similar for a hired hand's quarters, for a calving shed warming room, for a back pasture line camp. He said yes to all 3. He charged fair prices. He drew diagrams on the same yellow legal pad he had used 4 years before. He insisted, every time, on the sheep's wool, on the firebrick jacket, on the double intake and single exhaust, on the gravel bed beneath the floor. He did not lecture. He did not gloat. He simply built, the way he had always built, with the patient confidence of a man who had read the books nobody else had bothered to read. The cylinder stayed in the field. It is still there, as far as I know. Wendell lived in it for 2 more winters before he built a small proper house on the same parcel, set back against the windbreak of cottonwoods he planted his second summer. He kept the cylinder as a guest room. He kept the green notebook on the shelf above the stove in the new house, rubber-banded shut, the pages a little softer now from handling. I think about that notebook sometimes. I think about what it cost him to fill it. For winters of being cold. For winters of being talked about. For winters of reading by other people's lamps in other people's kitchens, taking notes on shelters he had not yet been allowed to build. I think about the men on the porch, and how certain they were, and how cheap that certainty turned out to be when the wind finally rose. I think about the difference between a man who looks at a rusted grain bin and sees a joke, and a man who looks at the same rusted grain bin and sees $900, 11 sticks of juniper, 66 degrees, and away through the worst night of a 50-year winter. I want to ask you something before this ends. The next time you see someone doing a thing that looks foolish to you, a thing that the people around you are already laughing at, a thing that seems obviously wrong in a way that makes the joke almost right itself, I want you to pause for one breath before you join in. I want you to ask yourself whether you have read what they have read. whether you have measured what they have measured, whether your certainty is built on anything heavier than the porch boards under your feet. Because somewhere out there, right now, someone is dragging a dented cylinder across a frozen field, and the people watching are already sharpening the punchline, and they have no idea what is inside that man's notebook. The storm came. In the end, the way storms always come. It did not care who had laughed and who had not. It only asked one question of every structure in its path, and the question was simple. Will you hold? The houses with their thin walls and their dead furnaces did not hold. The barns with their loose siding did not hold. The trucks left out overnight did not hold. The propane regulators did not hold. The power lines did not hold. The certainties of the men on the porch did not hold. A rusted steel cylinder in a pasture, wrapped in foam and sheep's wool and pine and the careful thinking of a young man nobody had wanted to listen to, held. It held at 20 below. It held at 30 below. It held at 41 below with a 70-mile wind tearing at the ridge above it. It held on 11 sticks of juniper and one small fire and a thermometer that did not move. When Harlan Bowers tells the story now, which he does only when asked, and only to certain people, he does not start with the storm. He starts with the laughter. He starts with the porch and the paper cups and the joke about the coffin. He starts there because he believes that is where the story actually began, and because he believes the people who hear it should know how it sounded on that side of the fence before they hear how it ended on the other. He always finishes the same way. He says that on the morning he climbed down that ladder for the first time, in the gray light of late November, he understood something he had not understood at 43 years of age in any other room he had ever stood in. He understood that warmth is not a luxury and not an accident and not a gift from a power company. He understood that warmth is a decision a person makes, slowly, over years, with their hands and their reading and their refusal to be talked out of what they have figured out for themselves. He says he learned that from a boy he had laughed at. He says he hopes he remembers it long enough to pass it on before the next bad winter finds him. And out in the field, under a low hump of grass in summer and a low hump of snow in winter, the cylinder is still there. The hatch still opens. The stove still ticks when someone lights it. The thermometer still hangs on its nail. The green notebook still sits on its shelf in the new house now, waiting for the next person who is willing to read what nobody else has read, and to build what nobody else believes can be built, and to stand quietly at the fence while the laughter starts, and to wait, with the patience of a man who has already done the math, for the wind to rise.